Coming up, no wide receiver at 6. Is that a possibility for the New York Football Giants? And if so, how do they go about fixing the lack of talent on the offensive side of the ball? We give you the answers. All coming up next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're thinking about the other way that things could go when it comes to the draft, which is now just 2 weeks away. Andy, we've been talking about Rome Odunze. We love him, even if we're not in the same category as others. Malik Neighbors, right? We know Marvin Harrison Jr. So much talent. It's impossible to miss out at the top. But what if? Just what if the New York Giants say, we're going to do something different? We have a different plan in mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We keep hearing it ad nauseum that it's either going to be a wide receiver or a quarterback. We on this show feel like Rome Odunze is the guy that we would prefer if the Giants pick at 6. But if they decide to take a quarterback or they decide to take Joe Alton and decide to completely transform the offensive tackle position, it leaves the Giants in an interesting situation where they still need to figure out the wide receiver room. Even if we do not get a wide receiver 1 at 6, they have to fill out that room because that need is still there regardless of what happens. And it feels like there's multiple paths for the Giants to be able to address that. Some probably more preferable than others, though, right?
100%. I mean, listen, we're going to get into the players throughout this draft that could be nice fits for the New York Football Giants. And really, this is something that like I had thought about. For the most part, Andy's going to steer the ship of this episode. But it's that thing that I think about. Okay, is player X, in this case, let's say Rome Odunze, is he worth more in totality to the team than players Y and Z, right? If you get multiple other players and you bring them in the room, is the individual talent level going to match Rome Odunze, going to match Malik Neighbors? No, probably not. However, does it make the team overall better, right? And that's, I think, the way that you'd have to approach something like this from a skills position standpoint. And my premise would be, and I wonder, we'll see how Andy feels about this. My premise would be that after all it's said and done, and the Giants are there and they're dancing and people are moving and maybe teams want to come up. But when I run my little sim in the background here, nothing happens. The Giants get to 6. They're sitting there. And they say, JJ McCarthy, come on down. We're gonna go ahead and get the young franchise quarterback that we believe in. We can develop him. No pressure. Andy hates this because now he's got Daniel Jones, Andrew Luck, and JJ McCarthy all in the books. But they get the franchise quarterback. This is I don't even know if this is the most reasonable option. Maybe it would be Joe Alton, bolstering the offensive line. But this just seems to be addressing one of those key offseason draft needs that the Giants have. So that would be my premise. JJ McCarthy, they take the quarterback. He's there for them. And now they step back and Joe Schoen goes, boom, scared money don't make money, baby. Also, we need at least 1 or 2 weapons for JJ McCarthy going forward.
Yeah, it's clear as day. If the Giants do decide to go with JJ McCarthy and they say, you're our guy for the future, we have a bridge year with Daniel Jones and Drew Lock, and we'll figure it all out. But next year we hand the reins to JJ, and it is your team essentially when they can move on more favorably from Daniel Jones. But to that point, then Joe Schoen has to say, well, we knew this would be the case. We still knew that we needed a wide receiver. And it feels like there's 4 different areas that the Giants could address the wide receiver position if they want to fill the void of a potential wide receiver 1 or a top per line wide receiver. And for me, the 4 different areas are still in free agency. There are still wide receivers that are out there. There is trade potential, Adam, where you can go get a wide receiver that's on another roster. The Giants could trade back into the first round and try to get one of those guys that may fall, or the Giants kind of sit pat in that second round at pick 47, and they sit there and say, we're going to wait for our guy. We're confident in some of the guys that are there. And so, Adam, we're going to do a little choose your own adventure here, if you would like to. And so the first question is, which pathway would you want to explore first if the Giants are not taking a wide receiver at 6?
Let's knock out what I think would, and it could change based on what they do, but let's knock out the least likely, pursuing a wide receiver that's still available on the market.
Great way to approach it, because I kind of thought the same thing, because you and me both were kind of like, well, who's left out there? Like, who could fill the void of a wide receiver 1 that's still on the market now? And There are certain players that I think are interesting. There are other players that have red flags. It doesn't feel like anything is a really good option when we talk about the free agent market, but I'll give you some names. There's
Mhm.
guys like Hunter Renfrow, who's still 28 years old, that got released by Las Vegas. Now, he's more of a slot receiver. It feels like we just keep loading up on slot receivers. Don't know if we want someone in that position and not necessarily outside. And then you have some of the bigger names like Odell Beckham Jr. still out there. Um, Michael Thomas from the New Orleans Saints are still out there. Those are veterans where you would expect it to be probably like a 1 year, maybe like with an option for a second year. And then there's kind of like the tertiary guys like Russell Gage, DJ Shark, and Tyler Boyd that are out there. Does anything kind of speak to you? Is it would you say Michael Thomas at his peak is an alpha type guy on the outside, and his spot track market value right now is about $9 million? Would you say, hey, we got the quarterback of our future? Maybe bring in Michael Thomas, knowing that his high of highs is almost as high as Odell Beckham when he was catching 120 balls, from Drew Brees, many years ago.
Yeah, it's funny too because when you mention these names, it's like, well, the brand sounds great, but I just don't know if the product is still the same quality as it was when I was buying it in the '90s, right? When all the cool kids wanted to have the OBJs on, it was like, hey, I got to spend $150 to get these bad boys. Now you're like, well, if I go on eBay, I can probably find them 15, $20. So Michael Thomas is an interesting one because of the injuries. Like I think it's like, where is he currently? Odell Beckham Jr., I just think that his body has fully probably betrayed him on these little levels where it just doesn't seem like he's going to be able to do it. And then with guys like that too, what I think you're going to see happen here is they're going to wait out the draft, right? And it's not doesn't preclude us from the conversation, but that's what I think is likely with these guys. Wait out the draft, who didn't get their guys, who missed out, and now maybe we get something, maybe some incentives. Thomas feels like a guy that'll hold out for the money that he wants, even on a 1 year deal. Beckham feels like maybe a little more incentive based. Out of the two, though, like I would say, there is something intriguing about Michael Thomas if he still has like 1 year left in him. I wouldn't spend the 9-10 million, mostly because I don't have $9-10 million. I don't have the money to go do it. So he might be the guy that I would look at out of that list. Boyd is certainly interesting, but you're talking about a guy that excelled as a wide receiver 3 in Cincinnati. So, where does his value truly lie once you put him on the field with what we feel like are some solid 2s and 3s? Like, does he end up getting to Boyd too? So cost wise, I don't know. Maybe Michael Thomas, but as you can tell, I'm not overly excited about going out on the market and bringing in that guy.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, Michael Thomas in 2019 was amazing. He had 149 receptions in 1 year with
It's just 4 years ago.
1,700 yards. He was an absolute beast, but it was age 26. Then you look at 2020, he played in 7 games, only had 400 yards. 2021, he missed the whole entire season.
Yeah.
2022, he played in 3 games. And 2023, he played in 10 games. So he's had
What were his numbers in those 10 games this last year?
He had 39 receptions for 448 yards. His yards per reception was literally exactly the number that his career average has been. Adam, the tough part with Michael Thomas is you hear all this groaning in the background of him
Yeah,
not
yeah.
being happy, and he doesn't seem like the type of guy that the Giants necessarily want to bring in. But when you get desperate, you end up having to make concessions at certain positions. A guy like Michael Thomas might look and say, hey, I could be the number one guy and reset my market value with the Giants. Whereas if I go anywhere else, I might have to be a complimentary piece, and maybe I can't reset myself for one more big payday. So I find Michael Thomas interesting. He's, to me, the guy that, if healthy, has probably the biggest upside of any of the free agents left. But the reason why he's still a free agent is it comes with a lot of other question marks around health and off field type
Yeah, of
issues.
course. Yeah. Personality fit. Like Odell Beckham Jr. seems like he got beyond that level of expectation, right? He's just trying to go places, trying to find a good fit, trying to get a couple of paydays. And you say reset the market. It's like at 30, 31, this might be the last payday that any of these guys kind of get. So you want to get the biggest squeeze. It's that being the case. No one is overly excited about the market, even if there is some possibilities out there. So we'll turn our attention to phase number 2 of me choosing my own adventure, which I'm not sure what it is yet. The Dungeon Master has to present it, and we'll get into that in just one moment. All right, where do I go next? I've walked into the cave of elderly wide receivers. I have tried out their knees and ankles. They crumbled before me, and now my path to choose is.
Oh, You're asking me which one you would like
Which
to
does
choose.
you
So
matter? Yeah,
the
you got,
three
and
that are
then, oh,
remaining.
there's a light in the corner of the cave, and it leads to
Well, so I think the next logical path would be trade. Let's talk about the Giants making a trade to get a
let's
wide
get into the
receiver,
trades.
and the other two we can focus on will be more towards the draft, which I think is probably going to be more interesting for us.
Yes.
So, Adam, in the trade market, there are quite a few wide receivers that would be intriguing for the Giants. Two big names come to mind. One would be Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers, who's been linked, unhappy, wants to get out of there as quickly as possible. And the other one is T. Higgins, who is like, you spent a year not talking to me about a contract extension, franchise tag me. I want out because I want my money as well. To me, Adam, they're the two best available ones on the free agent market, but they seem highly unlikely for the Giants. I'll give you the floor first. Do you see either of them as a possibility for the Giants?
I mean, not based on when we talk about what contracts go for, and both of them are deserving of that, now $20+ million contract range, right? So that could certainly be a problem for the New York Giants, unless you like truly believed in one of them, right? And you think, hey, yes, we could get a low cost guy, but we chose to get the quarterback, and we want to have a wide receiver in place for him. You know, Ayuk out of the two, I just think that he's that type of talent. But it's funny when you go back and you look at it, and it can be deceptive, right? Who else does he play with on the 49ers? How do those opportunities open up for him? The tight end position, that'll become a little factor of our conversation as we move along as well. But you go back 2020, 746 yards, 826 yards. Then these last 2 years, like really emerges. 1,000-yard receiver the past 2 seasons, 8 and 7 touchdowns. Like, I wonder if you were going to go this route for a player that is only 26 years old, this is the guy, because you are about to get his prime. If you're willing to pay for it, then go get the guy who is about to peak, and you're going to get the best version of him for the next 3 to 4 years, and that's going to be what you have at that number one, and that's fine. Like, I think it's a great idea, and you can go that route. It's actually the reason I stay away maybe from T. Higgins, because he's not young. I think he's 28, 29 years old, so a little bit older and just a little bit more of a concern about whatever contract you give. Unless it's the NFL, you want to avoid the back years, etc. But there has to be a little bit of that risk factor. Although I want to make sure that I'm 100% on Higgins' age.
Well, so T. Higgins is an interesting one. Obviously, T. Higgins is only 25 years old right
He's
now.
only 25. Why do I think he was on the? Why do I think he was older?
I don't know. I mean,
Why would I
he's
ask you
been.
that question? Why would I ask you the question? Why do I think T. Higgins is older?
I'm
I
like,
thought he
I
was
don't know
older. I don't
why
know
you
why. For
thought
some reason, I
like.
thought he was there like pre Jamar Chase, and then and then it worked out for him to get folded in. Okay, so I at least have to take that part of it off the table here. Same age, same
He
projected
was
in terms of
relatively
production.
young when he got drafted, which is one of the things. He was there before Jamar Chase, and they just franchise tagged him. So he's been there since he's been 20 years old. So that would make
Right,
sense that
right.
it
Been
would
around
kind
the
of in
league.
that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
progression path, right? But honestly, I think both of them are not viable options for the Giants. I would love it, but Joe Shane isn't going to give up a first round pick and pay one of them 28 to 30 million dollars right now. The Giants are just not
Mhm.
in a position to be able to do that. So Adam, of all the other trade candidates, there are different guys like John Mechie of the Houston Texans. Now they have Stephon Diggs that may be able to be pried away for a low cost thing. But again, we're looking for that wide receiver one, someone that maybe could come in and fill the void. And so I have a guy for you, and I want to know how you would feel if the Giants did this.
Okay.
The Denver Broncos are still in a rebuild. They have an $80 million dead cap hit from Russell Wilson. They are in a cap situation they don't want to be in. They are resetting the clock with a rookie QB. There are older guys that have been there before Sean Payton that they want to potentially move on from. They have already moved on from Jerry Jeudy because they did not want to pay him after this year.
That's right.
I look at a guy like Courtland Sutton, the wide receiver for the Denver Broncos, and I think he's a very interesting candidate for the Giants if they wanted to trade for him for a few reasons. The first one is he is under contract for the next 2 seasons, Adam. He's on a 2-year deal at a $17 million cap hit per year, which right now ends up being kind of a tier 2 price point when we
Right.
think about the explosion of wide receiver contracts. Like Michael Pittman's getting 21, 22 million. Courtland Sutton is the next tier under that. So that's the first thing, is that he's locked in for the next 2 seasons. The other piece of it is projections are saying he probably will only cost about a 4th, maybe a 5th round pick to be able to get him. We talked about T. Higgins before costing a first round pick and 30 million. How does someone like Courtland Sutton sound if the Giants traded a mid-round pick even in the 2025 draft and bring in a guy that you have under team control for the next 2 years at a number that seems relatively okay for what the Giants are looking for.
I finally got to a wide receiver that was 28, 29 years old, and that's going to be Courtland Sutton, right? So he's 28 years old now. So 2 years of control. It takes him until he's 30. I like having the team control. I don't know. Then the question becomes, and there's actually a perfect in-house guy to compare him to, right? Because he had a 1,000-yard season in 2019 with 1,100 yards. Since then, though, and he had an injury-plagued year in 2020, only showed up in one game. Been pretty healthy the rest of the way. Has had 776, 829, 772, had 10 touchdowns this past year. Obviously, a massive number there. Okay. But pretty much that's Darius Slayton. Like the numbers are all pretty much the same, and we're paying $7-8 million for Darius Slayton. So the question becomes, it's like, if I told you were right now, if you had to pay Darius Slayton $17 million each year over the next 2 seasons, I think you would hear from the fan base a little bit of, what the F are we talking about here? So there's something there. And if you want to talk about what Russell Wilson was or was not this year ago, right? Sometimes I think the numbers get a little inflated. Like the 10 touchdowns just seems like an absolute explosion. Never had more than 6 in his career and only had 2 each of the past 2 seasons. So I'm not against it in terms of like the individual player, but $17 million, even at for the position, what feels like a really nice bargain at that point, relatively speaking, I don't think he's a number one. So I can't, that's the first reason why I probably wouldn't go do it, even though it makes the team better. And then it'll probably take us to our next phase, which is, okay, so then where do you want to go get the guy and we get ourselves back into the draft? But I mean, does that track for you? Like, would you make that move on a 2025 4th rounder for Sutton for 2 years at 17 million?
It's difficult. I like what you're proposing about Darius Slayton. You're like, what if Darius Slayton's 85% of it and we already have him under contract? Why would you do it? I think they're 2 completely different types of wide receivers.
Oh,
Courtland
100%.
Sutton
Yeah, yeah.
is not a speed burner. Courtland Sutton is 6'4". He is a massive body. He is a red zone target. He's a go up and get it in traffic kind of guy. To me, that's kind of what the Giants are lacking. You have Darius Slayton with speed. You have Jalen Hyatt blow the top off speed. You have Wan'Dale Robinson, that shiftiness inside. I don't know if the Giants have that big-bodied wide receiver that can go up and grab a 50-50 ball. That, to me, fills a void. I think it's an interesting one because you think about it. Daniel Jones' money comes off the books. Mm-hmm. Darius Slayton's money will come off the books at the end of this season. And if you are drafting J.J. McCarthy in your scenario, you're giving him some consistency with a big-bodied number 1 wide receiver for this year and next year. And you're getting off of Courtland Sutton at that point when he's going to be in his 31-year season. You're moving on from him, it feels like, at the right timing. So I think if you miss out on the guys that you want, this feels like at least a viable consolation prize for the Giants.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, if you're not getting the wide receiver at the top of the draft, which comes with a decent price tag in itself too, right? If you're taking him 6th overall, if you don't get him there, then you at least marginally think about it. Okay, so we couldn't get it for 40% of the cost. Now at 100% price point, let's go look at player X, player Y, and see if we can go ahead and build out our roster in a better way. And by the way, short and long term, right? It's like, we want to see if Jalen Hyatt is ready to take that next step in his career. Okay, good. Adding the extra body in the room and then saying you have 4 players that you feel like at least 3 out of 4 have proven themselves, and then Jalen Hyatt you expect to take the next step. Hey, great. Now we're in a system where there's a lot of maneuverability. You can move guys, maybe Slayton a little bit from the outside, as we saw a year ago. Tried to use him in some different ways as well. So, not the worst case scenario. I'll say this: out of the players available on the market and what you presented as a potential viable trade, I don't hate that, especially when we're talking about Ayuk, especially when we're talking about Higgins. It seems better for me, shorter term money, shorter term commitment, and go get a player that at least has a track record and shows the ability to be a real threat when it comes to the red zone. In a second, though, what about that draft? And by the way, before we even touch on the draft, we will also note something that Andy mentioned there: height, red zone threat. Why is that pertinent to the New York Football Giants and preparing for the draft ahead? We'll get into that in just one moment. Andy, I slayed the aging veterans. I sat at the table and crunched the numbers of the GM. And now my journey has brought me all the way to the NFL draft and trying to provide quality weapons in the wide receiver room. But before we get there is this little thing that we've talked about before that we thought was probably going to be resolved by now, and yet looks like it could last well through the draft and even into the offseason. And that's one Darren Waller. And when you mentioned Sutton and you mentioned that height and size, That's the bell that rings. Big bodied guy who can be a playmaker for this team, may not even want to play football.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. The Giants are in a very weird predicament. Obviously, people caught up with Darren Waller recently, earlier this week, and asked him, like, when are you making that decision? Are you ready to decide what you're doing? And he's like, yeah, I'm not yet. And then they asked him,
I'm
well, are
thinking
you
about
going
it.
to let the Giants know? Maybe it probably makes sense before the draft to give him a heads up. He's like, sure, that would be great for them, but like, I'm not going to rush myself into anything. Like, good for them, but for me, it doesn't change anything at all. I just need to be ready before, like, the checks start clearing in training camp. And so, having Darren Waller be so wishy-washy, knowing that if he retires or you outright release him, the Giants can free up $6 million in space to allocate other places. I mean, Adam, just at a very high level, anything that you think of when Darren Waller kind of says, "Yeah, I'm still figuring it out, my friend."
I don't care. Like on the very basic level that he is productive when he's on the field and he was the best receiving option the Giants had when healthy a year ago. Like I get that. So like don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing that he's talented. But I am dismissing the idea that a 32-year-old tight end who has an injury history and is making good money as it stands right now is potentially considering the idea of walking away based on the premise about whether or not he likes what the Giants do in the draft. If you believe that it's about like, oh, who are they bringing in a quarterback? Who am I going to get the ball? Who's going to be throwing me the ball this year? If that's the case, man, then I'm all good. You are not a caliber of player and you are not at a point in your career where you get to do what, Jamar Chase would want to do or what Stephon Diggs would want to do a couple of years ago, demand a contract extension, right? Like you're not that guy. You've been really important to the Giants for the brief time that you've been with them, but that's because they didn't have anybody else. And that's why they drafted Jalen Hyatt. That's why they developed him. That's why we're talking about other options they'll bring in here through the draft. It's why Wan'Dale Robinson taking a step forward matters. It's why addressing the running back room matters. I get it. The Giants have only gotten weaker, at least for the moment, inside of their skills position room on the offensive side of the ball this offseason. But I am not going to be held hostage by Darren Waller and whether or not he doesn't like what the Giants do in the draft. And that's maybe I'm far afield here and I'll end up playing, and that'll be great. My instinct right now is that Joe Schoen really is just sitting here and saying, yeah, I'll go ahead and see how the draft unfolds. You want to stick around, great. But like, I got the post-June one in my back pocket. I save over $11 million on you. I take only a couple $1 million in dead cap. Like, I'm all good. I don't think that Joe Schoen is the type of GM that is in the business of getting into the waters like this with wide receivers, tight ends, anybody who feels like they're in a spot to not dictate terms, but basically say like, oh yeah, I'll see what you do and decide if I fit that process. Like that doesn't, and by the way, that doesn't strike me as a Brian Dable guy either, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Obviously, Joe Schoen, as of right now, probably wants Darren Waller back because the
Sure.
Giants are devoid of playmakers on offense. Like
Right.
you let Saquon Barkley go in free agency. Darren Waller was almost leading the league in yards when he was healthy at the tight end position. And so, like, you don't want that to just walk out the door, especially after you gave third round compensation to be able to get him on your team for an injury plagued single season.
Of course.
So, Joe Schoen still has to make other contingency plans, which is why getting a playmaker, in the draft is probably the most preferable thing because not only is it an area of need, but if Darren Waller goes out the door, you have to get explosive on the outside because I just still don't think a matchup of Devin Singletary, Darius Slayton, and Daniel Bellinger is going to instill fear in any of the defensive coordinators when they go into
Not
game
likely.
planning for someone like Daniel Jones or Drew Lock or JJ McCarthy. And
No,
so,
100%. And that's why we turn our attention to the NFL draft and we say, how do we get here? Right? We took JJ McCarthy at 6 overall. Now, what are the options? Andy, paint the picture for the ways in which you think are viable for the Giants to improve this wide receiver room beyond just saying, well, the next pick is 47. We'll see what happens there.
yeah, so there's kind of two ways that you can go about this. And I am under the understanding, Adam, and I think you would agree with me that rounds 1 and rounds 2 feel like they are the only real chance for the Giants to get an impactful wide receiver that can fill the void that we are looking for if they pass on 6. There may be guys that you could take a flyer on and hope that they can develop into something, but you're not sitting there saying, hey, this fifth round wide receiver like Puka Nacua, like we're guaranteeing he's going to be our alpha number 1 wide receiver. To me, that just doesn't seem like a advisable draft strategy for Joe Schoen. And so for me, it feels like there's two options. If the Giants pass on a wide receiver at 6, there is still the option for the Giants to trade back into the first round in order to get one of those top flight wide receivers. Now, Adam, it feels like there's a clear cut difference between the top three and maybe the next tier after you go from Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze. But Adam, it feels like kind of two of them to me are probably a little bit of a more intriguing than others if you're going to trade back into the first round. And those two would be Brian Thomas Jr. of LSU and Adonai Mitchell of Texas. Do you have a feeling like if the Giants move back in at, say, the 20th or 22nd or something pick, would either of them, would you want to spend the draft capital to move up for either Brian Thomas Jr. or Adonai Mitchell?
Yeah, Brian Thomas Jr. is like interesting because I think you go back and they talk about like, hey, there's games when you didn't have Malik Neighbors, necessarily on the field, and Thomas Jr. was able to dominate still. You go look at his individual matchups when he picked up the number one cornerback assignment and he was still very productive. So feels like he slides a little bit under the radar. My concern there is probably, like you said, 20, 22. Where do you get back in the first round? I think he goes top 20 at this point if I had to call it, because he's the next guy, right? After Marvin Harrison Jr., after Malik Neighbors, after Rome Odunze, anybody that felt like they wanted a wide receiver in round one is going to be looking and saying, okay, where are we? Like, if you really need to go get them, you can think about a team like Buffalo, maybe, like, what are they looking to do in their wide receiver room? So I think there's going to be a push to go get that guy. When it comes, Mitchell's intriguing to me. He basically has lived kind of in the mid to late 20s and hasn't moved. I happen to think that, like, he is a sneaky good player to go and get and probably steal what will reflect back on as being like top 15-ish kind of value in the draft when it's all said and done, because he has the size, 6'2", 205. We talked about Raz scores in the last couple of weeks on the podcast. He's a 9.99. Like, that's where he lands. So that you're getting the absolute peak of athleticism and all of the measurables. Has the length, has the speed to go deep, a 4.3 speed, efficient footwork. Like, and I went and watched his tape and it all looks right. Like, it all looks good. And we talked about previously, we talked top of the draft, who's throwing in the football, right? And how do you feel about the quality of football he's getting versus the one to get the NFL? I'd be fine with him. And I think he's out of the two. I would say more likely, if you're trying to get from 47 back to the first round, you're not getting up to 20 without giving up a lot. So if I sneak back in at the back end of the first round because Mitchell is there at 30, 31, 32, I'd be comfortable making that move for him for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously people talk about, his athletic and raw tools when you talk about speed and athleticism and size. Like, those are
You just got to
NFL
dial him in a
pro.
little bit. You just got to dial him in a little bit. That's all this kid needs.
Yeah, I mean, there's some challenges when you watch him on film where it's like, does he play every snap as hard as he could?
Right.
Is he like committed in the run blocking game, which the Giants desperately like want wide receivers that can block as well? Like, does he play as well in the contested catch situations as some other wide receivers? But that's why he's not going in the top 5. That's why he's going in the mid, late first round, because you see all these raw athletic traits and you say, man, if we could just harness some of that and get him to play at his potential, it could be limitless, especially given his athleticism. So right. I tend to agree with you. It feels like Brian Thomas might go 16, 17. You'd have to give up a war chest, maybe an additional first round pick just to get back in and get him. I think Adonai Mitchell, if you decide to move up, is probably the most likely guy the Giants would be targeting. When we talk about the last kind of piece of this, Adam, in the draft is, and to me, I feel like at 47, this is your last opportunity, in my mind, to get a guy that can be very impactful year one, that could project out to be a wide receiver one without having to speculate too far or project too far into the future. And so if the Giants decide to stand pat, it feels like there's a list of a handful of guys. And now I've kind of cherry picked a few because some of them don't really make sense for the Giants. Like Xavier Worthy, to me, is probably going to go a little bit earlier. He's got crazy blazing speed.
Isn't he nuts though? Just real quick on him. He's so interesting because it's like, obviously the combine, it's electric. And then you go like you say, if he was there at 47, I think it isn't like, you'd be like, hey, I mean, this dude can cook, right? And then you go and look at the skill set and you think, all right, like maybe he is better than people perceived and the combine elevated him. But to your point right now, it seems like he'll go like early second round, somewhere between 32 to 37 or 30, like before 40, like top 40 pick. And you're not going to, I don't think he's the guy you'd say, what does it take to make a margin move to move up 5 or 6 picks to go get this player? He is so intriguing though, man. Like I want him, not for the Giants, just in generally speaking, I want him to be electric when he gets to the NFL because it just feels like it should be. Like, you know what I mean? It just feels like that's what his journey should be after that combine.
Well, it's like I'd be shocked if he makes it past Buffalo with their areas of need in the late
Right.
first round. I'd be even more shocked if he gets past Kansas City with like the last pick in the first round. He seems perfect, like stretch the field guy
And
for
first
Patrick
round
Mahomes.
value, right? Like first round control too, right?
Exactly. You get that extra control on a wide receiver, and we know their market has exploded. So for me, it feels like he's probably, a candidate for other teams earlier. I kind of have a bucket of four guys potentially that I think I'd like to know which one you would prefer out of the four. If
Let's
you're
go.
going to stay in this position, these are the kind of the guys that are in this range, Adam. It's Troy Franklin out of Oregon, Xavier Leggett, as you've mentioned, from South Carolina, Keon Coleman from Florida State, and Jermaine Burton from the University of Alabama. Do any of those, if you're saying the Giants are sitting there at 47, which one do you feel makes you feel the most comfortable with the setup of getting JJ McCarthy in the first and then getting XY wide receiver that you hope would fall to the Giants?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, Troy Franklin seems like a guy that doesn't necessarily. It's like, oh yeah, he'll be there in the second round, right? That's okay. Like, and then if you want him, you can take him, and you can like that he has some size and those type of measurables. Leggett, oddly enough, when you go look at him, it's actually one of the reasons like I take a little bit of pause here on him is because a lot of mocks now like they have him sliding a bit. He's dropping a little bit further back because he has all these physical traits, but maybe is raw, and you're going to have to work with him. Like if you think about the Giants wide receiving room, you go, yeah, but maybe a nice physical raw receiver is exactly what you want to be able to play on the outside, move around a little bit, and then offer some protection for the underneath routes when we talk about Robinson, Jalen Hyatt with his long speed, all these things, right? So complementary, it's nice. But I want to pull up, you mentioned there, one that I was interested in and I've looked at before, and that's Jermaine Burton. Like he is pretty intriguing to me. Only 6 foot, just under 200 pounds. But when you went and watched him, I look at him as being, it looks like he's doing a lot of things at like 85% of what you want. And if you can get it to be 90+% of what you want, all of a sudden you have a pretty nice receiver for you. He's intriguing in this range here. Like talking about all these guys, I find him a little bit more interesting than I did maybe say a month ago.
Yeah, I think Jermaine Burton's interesting. I was going to highlight Keon Coleman just because
People seem to be
he
higher on
it's
him. Like you're getting
it
news out of
well,
like teams that like teams are higher on him than maybe media or people perceive him to be as a talent.
Well, he's a big body wide receiver. He was productive in college. Like when you see that, you're like, man, that could translate. And to me, Adam, the interesting thing about one of the things on NFL Draft was that Keon Coleman that was noteworthy to me is they wrote one of his strengths is distinguished for his proactive alpha mentality, adept at contested catches, thanks to a combination of instincts and sheer hand strength.
There
And
we
to
go.
me, it's like, okay, Keon Coleman is an alpha mentality, big body wide receiver. Coincidentally, he reminds me a little bit of Courtland Sutton, where like he's not going to blow you away with speed, but he's got this big bodied frame and can go up and make these big contested catches and is that alpha type guy. He his weaknesses are clear. He is not a burner. He does not have speed. He runs a 4.6 40. His acceleration off the line is slow. He's probably
Yeah.
not going to get as much separation. Maybe you hope that it's better than Devontae Parker type guy who gets no separation whatsoever. But he is an interesting one because he brings a different dynamic to the New York Giants wide receiver room, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that he's a good one too. And these are all guys when we talk about getting into that 50-ish, top 50 kind of range, right? Top 60 kind of range is where do they fall? And then it's positional needs. Teams that grab the wide receiver a little bit earlier, all of a sudden these guys become more available. I find it interesting, but I'll throw out my scenario to you if I could, as I walked through a little bit of a mock in the background here. And I kept it very simple. You know me, Andy. I don't like to mess around. I don't get into trades and all this kind of stuff. But as we said at the top, JJ McCarthy is Denver came up and I got 51 and 98 from them. And this actually, more than anything, is important to point out as I think this would start to play a factor for the Giants if they go with a quarterback at the 6th overall spot. They don't trade down at all, and then they still know they have some positional needs. So when I walked through this one, might be dream-ish scenario. And I go different. You said 47, top 50, you got to go wide receiver, last chance to get him. I took Jonathan Brooks at 51 because he's not only a great piece in the backfield, he's also a great run after catch guy. Then at 70, Roman Wilson. Oh my God, he played at Michigan, the same place that JJ McCarthy played. I go ahead and grab Phillips, the cornerback out of Kentucky at 98. And then I grab Cade Stover at 106. Why? Because I know that Darren Waller is not going to be a part of this team. I want a big body guy like you talk about. This ends up becoming, by the way, a highly aggressive, 107, I take him out, excuse me, a highly aggressive, offensive laden, draft for the New York Football Giants. But hey, as long as I can find, and I gloss over the fact that I took, Phillips out of Kentucky, is he the right fit? Did I pick too late for a cornerback? We don't know for sure. But as long as I feel like I can solve that one other spot, I think next time we talk, it'll be about what are the viable options for cornerback on the market? How do you address that area of need? This, to me, whether or not all these players would fall there, I did it. I got a backfield weapon that can catch as well. I got a number one wide receiver from the college level that has experience with the rookie quarterback I'm bringing in. And I also went, even though they got a lot of blocking tight ends this offseason, I got myself a weapon that I think can high point some footballs for me in the red zone.
Adam, I like that. I think you didn't go you didn't go far enough. You need to go with the Knicks. You need to go with for the basketball reference, the Knicks Villanova reference. You need to add Blake Corum in the backfield as the running back by committee. So then you have JJ McCarthy, Blake Corum, Roman Wilson. You just need to start stockpiling from a single university and see how that works out.
Blake Corum is the Mikal Bridges, of that scenario where he just, for somehow he ends up on the Washington Commanders, and every time they see 2 times a year, they go, I don't understand what happened. I thought we were all going to play together. This is weird. So there you go. Yeah. But I think this does illustrate, and this was Andy's brainchild to walk through this version of it. And it is delicate, right? When I say Roman Wilson, we'll talk about these guys deeper, but now go read up on them and go make this decision about what is that relative to Rome Odunze, to Malik Neighbors, and what is the difference of if you think you can get Brooks and a Roman Wilson, are getting those two players more viable than just one of them? If you only get the running back at 47 potentially, is that too high to be taking that guy? Part of this is why did I take Brooks? Because I didn't take a wide receiver in the first round. So now all of my positional skill needs elevate because you need to address them that much sooner. And it needs to be, as far as the draft goes, as surefire a bet as you can, because you didn't get the elite talent there, but you feel like you got the quarterback. And that's, I think, the one realistic scenario here for the Giants is we want the quarterback, we get the quarterback, and then we think about how do we set this up for success over the next 1 and 2 seasons.
Yeah, and Adam, at the end of the day, what we laid out here, it could be actually a combination of a lot of things that we just talked about. There is a world that the Giants select Roman Wilson and they trade their 4th round pick for Courtland Sutton and say, we didn't get our wide receiver 1. We have to figure out a way for this room to look better. So I think that there's multiple ways that this could go, and it could be a few of the names that we actually mentioned.
Yeah, and I'll say that actually it's a really good point, because if you went that route, if you're thinking, broad, if you're Joe Schoen on draft day and you're leading up to the draft, all of a sudden you turn around and you think about, well, what do I want to do at 70, at 98, Roman Wilson, we say, or at 51, 47, whatever it is, when you're talking about picking running back or not. If you have this idea that you're going to go trade for wide receiver X, that's going to influence how you walk through the draft. So we know 2 weeks away, we're going to run through a lot of these scenarios. I think this one is not unreasonable. The question is, do Giants fans like it? Do they like the idea of JJ McCarthy in the building at 6? Do they like the idea of not taking a wide receiver who will 100% be there no matter what happens? As Andy keeps saying, 1 through 5, no matter what happens, there will be a wide receiver for the Giants if they want him at 6. Let us know in the comments. Get over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast, on X at One Giant Podcast, at AndyMac214, and at Adam Armbrecht, and the podcast feed wherever you get those needs fulfilled. Until next time, though, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.